Here we have Sally and Bob, and so we have a couple here, and this particular couple is going to have some offspring, so they're going to have some children, and we want to talk about some characteristics that could potentially be inherited in their offspring, or that could show up in their offspring. So if we look at a character called widow's peak here, widow's peak is very common as far as genetics examples go. And what we're looking at is, notice that there's this little point in the hairline here on the mother. And so Sally has a widow's peak, but Bob over here has no widow's peak. So as we start to talk about genetics, we have this term called a phenotype. And the phenotype is the appearance. So what they look like, which in this case is just, do they have a widow's peak or do they not have a widow's peak? And so Sally's phenotype would be widow's peak and Bob's phenotype would be no widow's peak. We can also talk about what we call a genotype. And the genotype describes the specific alleles that an individual has. And so Sally will have a specific genotype and Bob will have a specific genotype. So to understand what the genotype possibilities are, first we need to know what alleles we have or what possibilities we have for this widow's peak gene. So I'm going to use the letter A to designate this widow's peak gene. And in this case, we have two versions. We have a capital and a lowercase. And the capital version is going to be the information to create a widow's peak, and I'm just abbreviating that WP. And little a is going to code for no widow's peak. So I'm giving you the information for Sally's genotype here. She has two capital A's. And so since she has two capital A's, she has a widow's peak. Bob, on the other hand, has two lowercase a's, and he does not have a widow's peak because he has two copies of no widow's peak. So these that I've drawn right here, this little a, and then also this over here, that would be the genotype of those two individuals. Okay, so if we talk about the cross that we could get from these two, okay, if we're going to actually have a mating or have a cross between the two, the first thing that we really have to have is we have to have an egg from Sally and we have to have a sperm from Bob. And so for Sally, when that egg is produced, and that egg would be produced through the process of meiosis. So here is my egg. And so in that egg, we're going to get just one of these possibilities here, because remember the eggs are going to be haploid. So if something is haploid, it only gets one copy of each chromosome, which then would be one copy of each gene. So for this example, since Sally only has capital A, we can make this determination that the capital A is the version that's going to be in the egg. And then from Bob, he is also going to undergo meiosis, and he's going to produce sperm cells. And since he only has lowercase a, the sperm cell is going to get a lowercase a. So through the process of then fertilization, when we get fertilization, the egg and the sperm will combine, and what we end up with is we end up with a zygote now is what we're going to call this. So this is my zygote, and that zygote has one capital A and it has one lowercase a. And that then would grow into the embryo, which would develop into the child. So if we talk about some things about this zygote that we have, this letter combination that we see right here, big A, little a, that would be the genotype of this offspring or of this child. Now, if we want to talk about the phenotype is what it's going to look like. So is it going to have a widow's peak or is it not going to have a widow's peak? And this is where the capital letter versus the lowercase letter becomes very important, because the capital letter over here, the capital A, this is what we refer to as the dominant allele. And then the lowercase, we're going to refer to as the recessive allele. And what those terms really mean is that if you have a situation where you have one of each, which is exactly what we have here, the dominant one, the capital letter, is going to dominate. Or in other words, the dominant is going to cover up, or you could say mask, the presence of the recessive. So what that means is that this one, for its phenotype, we're going to get a widow's peak. Again, widow's peak because that is the look of the capital A, and the capital A is the dominant one. So capital A is going to cover up the presence of the lowercase a there. Now, if we go back up here and we look and talk again about Sally and Bob's phenotype, of course, we gave them those phenotypes because we could actually see their hairline up here and we could tell whether they had a widow's peak or not. But if you did have two capital A's, then definitely you're going to have a widow's peak. If you have two lowercase a's, then all of the information, both copies actually say no widow's peak. So that makes sense that that would be the case for Bob as well. So notice that for somebody, if you just came across one person and they had a widow's peak, or if you, for example, have a widow's peak, there are two possibilities for your genotype. So if you have a widow's peak, just the random person on the street, you could be big A, or you could have one of each. If you have no widow's peak, and again, just the random person on the street, then you would have two copies of the lowercase. And that's because that's the only combination that would give you no widow's peak. If you do not have the presence of a capital A, then by default, you will have no widow's peak. The genotype, or the genetic makeup of an organism, can be classified in a couple different ways. We can have what we call homozygous genotypes, and then we also have what we refer to as heterozygous genotypes. So if we look at the beginnings of these two words, homo means same and hetero means different. And this really does describe very well what we have with these two. So homozygous is when you have two copies of the same allele. And so we did see two examples of that. We had one parent, Sally, that had capital A, and then we had another parent that had little a. So those would both be considered homozygous. If we kind of classify them a little bit more, this one, big A, we can call that homozygous dominant. And we refer to it as homozygous dominant because we have two copies of the dominant allele. And then this one we can refer to as homozygous recessive because, again, in this case, we have two copies of the recessive allele. We refer to this as being true breeding. And true breeding refers to the fact that we know that that individual is always going to pass on that particular allele that they have. So in other words, there's no variety for this gene in that individual. So if we're talking about the homozygous dominant parent, that homozygous dominant parent will always pass on the big A to the offspring. Or if we're talking about the homozygous recessive parent, that one will always pass on the little a to the offspring. So true breeding is how we describe them. Sometimes we call them purebreds, would just be another word that describes it. Now, if we talk a little more about the heterozygous condition, when you are heterozygous, you have two different alleles. And so the genotype of the zygote in our previous example was heterozygous because that one had a capital A and a lowercase a. Now with this, when we do talk about the appearance or the phenotype of the heterozygous one, the heterozygous will have the phenotype of the dominant allele. And again, that's really why we call that particular allele dominant, because it's going to really cover up or mask the presence of the lowercase allele.